The Atlantic Ocean in late winter carries a steady indifference. Trade winds move without urgency, and long swells travel thousands of miles with no awareness of what floats above them. In February, the water temperature in the open ocean between the Canary Islands and the Caribbean remains cold enough to slow the body, but not cold enough to announce danger. The sky often stays clear. The horizon holds its shape. This region of the Atlantic is defined less by landmarks than by distance. Shipping lanes cross it, but they are thinned and widely spaced. Fishing vessels pass irregularly. Days can move without interruption. From the surface, there are few signs of proximity to land. From below, the currents run westward, persistent and quiet, carrying debris, organisms, and anything else that remains afloat. Weather in these latitudes is typically stable during winter months. Storms do occur, but they are not constant. More often, conditions are manageable, even calm. Wind speeds rise and fall. Waves form patterns that repeat for days. The ocean does not feel hostile. It simply continues. A small sailing vessel on this water appears briefly and then disappears again into scale. From a distance, it is indistinguishable from flotsam. Its progress is slow, measured in miles per hour, not days. Navigation depends on instruments and routine. Errors are rarely immediate. Consequences take time. Survival stories that begin here rarely announce themselves. There is no sudden violence in the setting, no warning in the color of the water. The Atlantic offers space before it offers threat. It allows motion. It allows quiet. Only later does it test limits. At the start, there is only the sea as it exists most days, open, repetitive, and unconcerned with the people who cross it. Stephen Callahan was not new to the sea. By the early 1980s, he had spent years working around boats, both professionally and privately. He had trained as a boat builder and designer, apprenticing in traditional wooden construction before moving into fiberglass work. Sailing was not a novelty for him. It was a skill developed gradually through repetition and exposure rather than bravado. Callahan was born in 1952 in the United States. In his 20s, he traveled extensively, often by boat, taking seasonal work in marinas and shipyards. He learned to repair hulls, rigging, and fittings. He understood how vessels failed and how they endured. Over time, he became comfortable sailing alone, managing navigation, maintenance, and watchkeeping without assistance. The boat he chose for his Atlantic crossing was a small sloop named Napoleon Solo. It measured approximately 21 feet in length. By ocean crossing standards, it was modest, but not unprecedented. Similar vessels had completed transatlantic passages before. The boat was equipped with basic navigation tools, safety gear, and provisions calculated for a solo voyage. In January 1982, Callahan departed from the Canary Islands with the intention of reaching the Caribbean, likely Antigua. The route followed the established westward trade wind passage, commonly used by sailors crossing from Europe or North Africa to the West Indies. This route relies on consistent winds and currents rather than speed. The crossing typically takes several weeks in small vessels. Callahan's preparation reflected a balance between experience and limitation. His boat carried food, fresh water, flares, a life raft, and a basic emergency kit. Like many solo sailors of the period, he relied on celestial navigation and dead reckoning. Satellite tracking and emergency beacons were not yet standard equipment for private sailors. Once at sea, communication with the outside world was minimal or non-existent. The decision to sail alone was not unusual for him. Solo passages reduce complexity. There are fewer variables, fewer conflicting decisions. Responsibility remains singular. For Callahan, the voyage was part of a longer pattern of movement rather than a singular challenge. He was traveling, not testing himself. At the time, transatlantic sailing retained an element of isolation that is difficult to replicate today. Ships passed, but not frequently. A small sloop could go unseen for days or weeks. Rescue depended on proximity and chance. Distress signals required line of sight or radio contact, neither of which was guaranteed. Nothing in Callahan's background suggested recklessness. His route was conventional, the season was appropriate. The vessel, while small, was seaworthy by prevailing standards. The journey did not stand out among thousands of similar crossings undertaken each year. What distinguished this passage was not its intention, but what interrupted it. The context of skill and preparation matters because it frames what followed. This was not a case of inexperience meeting the ocean. It was a trained individual moving through a familiar system that failed in a specific and irreversible way. By late January, Napoleon Solo was well into the Atlantic. The Canary Islands were far behind. The Caribbean lay weeks ahead. The boat moved steadily westward, one day indistinguishable from the next. Then, without warning, the routine ended. In the early hours of January 29, 1982, the Atlantic was calm. There was no storm system moving through the area. Wind conditions were ordinary for the trade wind route. Visibility was limited only by darkness. Stephen Callahan was asleep below deck when the impact occurred. The force was sudden and decisive. Napoleon Solo lurched violently, throwing Callahan from his bunk. The hull had been struck from below. The exact cause was never confirmed, but the damage pattern and circumstances strongly suggested a collision with a whale or other large marine animal. The impact breached the hull near the waterline. Water entered the boat immediately. Callahan moved to assess the damage, but the situation progressed faster than any standard response allowed. The sloop began taking on water at a rate beyond manual pumping. Within moments, it was clear the boat would not remain afloat. There was no time to send a distress call, no time to attempt a controlled repair. The failure was structural and final. Callahan retrieved what he could. He activated and deployed his inflatable life raft, which had been stored on deck. As the boat settled lower in the water, he gathered emergency supplies and climbed into the raft. The sequence was compressed into minutes. Decisions were made without reflection. Napoleon Solo sank soon after. The mast disappeared, the hull followed. The ocean's surface closed over the site with little disturbance. When daylight arrived, there was no trace of the vessel. Callahan found himself alone in a small inflatable life raft, adrift in the open Atlantic. He had limited water, some emergency rations, a solar still, flares, a knife, basic tools, and a fishing kit. He also had a sextant which he had managed to save, though its practical use from a raft was uncertain. The nearest land lay more than 1,000 miles away. Shipping lanes existed, but he had no reliable means of signaling beyond visual range. His position was approximate. The currents moved westward, whether he acted or not. This was the point at which the voyage ended and survival began, not with a gradual decline, but with a single, unambiguous loss. From that moment forward, there was no return to the conditions that had existed before the impact, only continuation. The life raft was designed for short-term emergencies. It was circular, inflatable, and measured just over 6 feet across. A fabric canopy provided partial cover from sun and spray. The floor sagged into the water, allowing the raft to ride low. Movement within it was constrained. There was no standing. All tasks were performed seated or kneeling. From the first full day, Callahan organized what he had. Supplies were limited and visible, which made accounting unavoidable. Emergency rations were intended to last a few days. Fresh water was minimal. The most significant piece of equipment was a solar still, a plastic device that floated in the water and used evaporation and condensation to produce drinkable water from seawater. Under ideal conditions, it could yield small amounts each day. He deployed the still and adjusted it repeatedly to improve output. The process required attention. Angle, exposure, and cleanliness affected production. Even when functioning well, it produced water in quantities measured in ounces. Intake had to be regulated. There was no surplus. Food required improvisation. The emergency kit included a basic fishing line and hooks. Callahan adapted these, fashioning lures from scraps of material. Fish were present beneath the raft, often attracted by shade. Catching them required patience and precision. Once caught, the fish were killed and prepared on the raft itself. With no fuel and no fire, the fish were eaten raw. Portions were small and carefully divided. Bones, skin, and organs were used as efficiently as possible. Waste was minimized. Nutritional balance was not achievable. Adequacy was the goal. Exposure was constant. During the day, the sun was unbroken. The canopy reduced direct radiation but did not eliminate it. Reflected light from the water intensified heat. Callahan covered his skin where possible, but space and materials were limited. At night, temperatures dropped. The wet floor drew heat from the body. Sleep came in intervals. Time became structured around tasks rather than hours. The solar still required monitoring. Fishing occurred when conditions allowed. Equipment needed maintenance. Salt accumulation had to be removed. Small tears in fabric were repaired before they expanded. Navigation, while limited, was not abandoned. Callahan used his sextant when conditions permitted, attempting to estimate latitude. Longitude was more difficult to determine accurately without precise timekeeping, but general westward drift was assumed based on prevailing currents and winds. He adjusted the raft's small sea anchor to influence orientation, not direction. Control was minimal, but not non-existent. Signaling for rescue was a parallel routine. Flares were conserved. They were not used indiscriminately. Aircraft and ships were rare. When one appeared, Callahan assessed distance and trajectory before deciding whether to signal. Several times, vessels passed without noticing the raft. The scale difference was overwhelming. Even with signaling, detection was uncertain. Marine life was a constant presence. Fish swam beneath and around the raft. Birds occasionally appeared, often far from land. Sharks were frequent visitors. They circled and nudged the raft, sometimes bumping it from below. Their presence was persistent but not aggressive. Callahan took measures to discourage contact, using tools to tap or push them away when necessary. The raft itself deteriorated over time. Constant exposure to salt water, sun, and abrasion weakened seams and fittings. Inflation pressure had to be adjusted daily. Leaks were small but cumulative. Repair kits were finite. Each fix reduced future options. Health management became a system of prevention rather than treatment. Salt sores developed where skin remained wet. Callahan adjusted posture and padding to reduce friction. He rationed movement to conserve energy. Weight loss was steady. Strength diminished gradually. Mental discipline was maintained through routine. Tasks were performed in consistent order. Records were kept where possible. Days were marked. This structure imposed continuity on an otherwise uniform environment. Without it, time blurred. The ocean did not change significantly. Weather remained generally stable, though occasional squalls passed through. Rain was collected when possible, supplementing the still's output. These moments were functional rather than relieving. Each resource had to be captured without waste. As weeks passed, the raft drifted westward across the Atlantic. Callahan's estimates suggested a distance exceeding 1,000 miles. The environment remained open water. No land appeared. The sense of movement was abstract, inferred from sun angles and current behavior rather than physical progress. Equipment failures accumulated. The solar still suffered damage and required constant attention. Fishing success varied. Some days yielded nothing. On others, small fish were caught in succession. Intake fluctuated, but reserves did not exist. Each day stood alone. Despite the constraints, the system held. Callahan remained alive through adherence to process. There were no dramatic turning points within this period. Survival was achieved through repetition, adjustment, and restraint. By the 6th week, physical decline was evident. Weight loss affected insulation and endurance. Fine motor tasks became more difficult. Healing slowed. The margin for error narrowed. Still, the routine continued. Water was collected. Fish were caught when possible. The raft was maintained. Signals were prepared but withheld unless conditions justified their use. The Atlantic carried the raft steadily onward. Currents did not pause. Wind direction varied but remained generally favorable to westward drift. The system that sustained Callahan was fragile, but it remained intact through daily attention. This phase of survival did not rely on hope or rescue. It relied on continuity. As long as the processes functioned, the outcome remained undecided. That balance would not hold indefinitely. By the 7th week, the cumulative effects of exposure and deprivation became more pronounced. Callahan's body mass had significantly decreased. Muscle strength declined, particularly in the legs and hands. Tasks that once required little effort now demanded planning and rest. Recovery from exertion slowed. Saltwater sores worsened despite constant attention. Areas of skin that remained wet for long periods broke down. Infection was a persistent risk. There were no antibiotics. Care consisted of cleaning, drying when possible, and minimizing friction. Pain was managed through adjustment rather than treatment. The solar still, already delicate, became increasingly unreliable. Its plastic components degraded under constant ultraviolet exposure. Small failures required makeshift repairs. Output fluctuated. On days when production dropped, dehydration became an immediate concern. Intake had to be reduced further, approaching the minimum necessary for basic function. Fishing success declined. Whether due to changing conditions, reduced strength, or simple chance, catches became less frequent. Missed opportunities carried consequences that extended into following days. There was no buffer. Psychological pressure increased as margins narrowed. The routine remained, but its effectiveness weakened.
The effort required to maintain systems rose, while returns diminished. Each task consumed a greater proportion of available energy. Sleep became irregular. Discomfort, cold, and the need for vigilance interrupted rest. Dreams, when they occurred, were brief and indistinct. Days were marked, but their differentiation grew less meaningful. Time compressed into cycles of need and response. Signaling opportunities continued to be rare. Aircraft passed occasionally at high altitude, out of range of visual signals. Ships appeared as distant shapes on the horizon, sometimes close enough to identify, but not close enough to attract attention. Flares were conserved. A misused signal could eliminate the possibility of rescue later. Shark encounters persisted. They were no longer novel. Their presence added to fatigue rather than fear. The raft bore additional wear from repeated contact. Each nudge tested seams that had already been repaired. Physical symptoms multiplied. Dizziness occurred during exertion. Fine motor control suffered. Small tasks took longer and required retries. The risk of accidental loss increased. Dropping a tool or tearing fabric carried disproportionate consequences. At this stage, survival depended on error avoidance. There was little capacity to recover from mistakes. Decisions were conservative. Movement was minimized. Systems were protected, even at the cost of comfort. Callahan noted that emotional extremes were largely absent. The situation did not escalate into panic or despair in a single moment. Instead, it narrowed. Options reduced. The environment remained constant, while the capacity to respond diminished. The raft continued drifting westward. Currents did not slow. The ocean's surface offered no indication of proximity to land. Birds were still scarce. The water remained deep and uniform. By the end of the 9th week, Callahan's condition was fragile. Survival was still possible, but the window was closing. The systems that had sustained him were nearing their limits. Whether rescue or landfall would occur in time was unknown. The process continued because stopping was not an option. On the 76th day adrift, the character of the sea began to change. The water shifted in color, moving from deep blue to a lighter tone. Floating vegetation appeared intermittently.
Bird activity increased, no longer limited to solitary passes at high altitude. These were indirect indicators rather than confirmation, but they suggested proximity to land. Callahan was no longer capable of sustained exertion. His movements were slow and deliberate. The raft remained functional, though heavily worn. Repairs held, but only narrowly. Later that day, land became visible. The shoreline was low and indistinct at first, a darker line beneath the horizon. As the raft drifted closer, the outline resolved into hills and vegetation. The island was Guadeloupe, in the Lesser Antilles. Callahan had covered an estimated 1,800 miles since the loss of Napoleon Solo, carried almost entirely by wind and current. Approach was uncontrolled. The raft moved with the swell toward the coast. Breaking waves formed over shallow water. Without the strength to paddle or steer effectively, Callahan prepared for impact rather than navigation. The raft was pushed through surf and into shallow water. It grounded near shore. Callahan exited with difficulty, supporting his weight against the raft and the water. He collapsed shortly after reaching land. Local residents found him soon after. He was emaciated, dehydrated, and unable to walk unassisted. Medical attention followed. His condition reflected prolonged starvation and exposure, but there were no irreversible injuries. There was no announcement, no immediate recognition of what had occurred. The event concluded quietly, as most of it had unfolded. The raft, damaged and deflated, was left behind. Callahan survived. The survival did not end with a rescue at sea or a dramatic retrieval. It ended with contact, land underfoot, other people present. The process no longer singular. The ocean continued moving behind him, unchanged. Stephen Callahan's survival did not alter maritime practice or redefine the risks of ocean travel. Small vessels continue to cross the Atlantic. Life rafts remain emergency tools rather than habitats. The conditions that carried him to land persist without adjustment. What his experience provided was documentation. After his recovery, Callahan recorded the details of his time adrift in a first-person account. The record is valued not for drama,
but for precision. It outlines what was used, what failed, and what sustained a human body in prolonged isolation at sea. The significance of the event lies in its restraint. There were no improbable turns, no external interventions until the end. Survival resulted from incremental decisions repeated over time, under conditions that allowed little margin for error. The Atlantic did not test him in a singular moment. It applied steady pressure. The outcome was determined by response rather than resistance. Callahan's drift across the ocean remains one of the longest solo survivals in a life raft without resupply. It stands as an example of endurance shaped by method, not force. When the raft touched land, the process stopped. The sea did not acknowledge the difference.